Hey guys, tonight we explore a world that buzzed with more than just beeswax and honey. Imagine a courtroom, stone walls, candlelight flickering, a judge in heavy robes, scribes scratching ink across parchment. Now picture a box on the table. Inside, hundreds of bees, not for evidence, not for spectacle, but because they had been summoned to appear. You're not dreaming. This was medieval Europe, and the bees were on trial. The air in medieval towns wasn't fresh. You think your neighbor's cooking is overpowering? Try open sewage, burning tallow, and livestock stench all swirling under a thatched roof. You would not last a day here. Yet amid all that chaos, these people built legal systems detailed enough to prosecute an entire beehive. It wasn't a joke. Bees held social, spiritual, and legal significance. They were vital to medicine, food, light, and ritual. So when bees stepped out of line, stung a priest, invaded a monastery, or trespassed on noble land, the courts stepped in. It sounds absurd now, but to them, it was as serious as trying a thief or a heretic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and drift into this candlelit world where bees are more than insects. They are citizens. Their buzzing is treated as speech, their movements as evidence, and their honey, well, that's another kind of power altogether. You're standing in a medieval village, timber-framed. Houses lean inward like gossiping grandmothers. Smoke curls from crooked chimneys. And somewhere nearby, you hear the low, constant hum of a hive. Not just any hive, though this one's special. It sits beneath a window, half shaded by trailing ivy, and its owner guards it like gold. That's because honey is everything here. Sugar hasn't arrived yet, not for common folk. Honey is how you sweeten gruel, treat wounds, preserve fruit, and pay taxes. A single hive could feed your household, heal your sick, light your lamps, and even save your soul. No pressure, little bees. Walk a bit farther, and you'll see where law meets nature. The village scribe, half blind, ink-stained, keeps a register of every local hive. Not just who owns it, but where its bees fly, when they swarm, and whether their honey has been weighed fairly. If a swarm crosses into another's land, it's not just nature doing its thing. It's potential trespass, legal tension, and possibly a trial. Bees weren't mere livestock. They weren't pigs or goats. They were something more ethereal. They obeyed strange rules, moved like smoke, yet always returned faithful, organized, mysterious. In a world obsessed with divine order, bees became tiny role models. Monks wrote sermons about them. Kings ordered their hives counted. And if they misbehaved, the law was ready. And here's the weird part. This wasn't some isolated quirk. Across Europe, from France to Poland to the British Isles, documents survived describing legal proceedings involving bees. In one case, an entire hive was removed from consecrated ground and placed on spiritual probation. In another, a villager was fined for enticing bees with deceptive flowers. That's right. Bee seduction made the court scrolls. Historians still argue whether these cases were fully serious or half symbolic. Some believe they reveal deep superstition. Others think they were satirical jabs at legal excess. But either way, they happened, and someone had to speak for the bees. The role of bee lawyer was often informal. Maybe a monk who tended the hives. Maybe a villager with a reputation for fairness. This person would stand in court and offer explanations for the bees' behavior. They were provoked. They were unaware of the boundary. The stung man had committed a sin. You chuckle, but think about it. Today, we build fences. We track GPS. But back then, bees were free-flying agents with no leash, no collar. If they caused damage, someone had to answer. And since the bees couldn't speak for themselves, unless you counted buzzing a human proxy was necessary, as absurd as this seems, it reveals something touching. People believe that even creatures without words deserved a hearing. That no act, however, small should go unexamined. In an age without microscopes, their legal imagination zoomed in anyway. And so, with buzzes transcribed into argument, wings judged as actions, and honey measured like gold, the medieval world created a place where bees stood side by side with man. In the courtroom, you're still in that medieval village, but now you're peering inside one of the timber-framed cottages. The air is thick with wood smoke and beeswax. In the corner, yes, you're seeing this right is a large woven skep hive nestled beside the hearth. Bees come and go through a small hole in the wall, like tiny tenants with impeccable work ethic. And no, you haven't stumbled into a beekeeper's hut. This is just a regular home. A peasant family lives here with their bees. It wasn't unusual. In parts of rural Europe, especially during colder months, villagers brought their hives inside to protect them from frost and thieves. There's something both cozy and absurd about it. Imagine trying to sleep while hundreds of bees hum beside your head. You thought your neighbor's ceiling fan was loud? Try a choir of insects with a built-in percussion section. But that hum meant hope. Bees were more than bugs. They were providers, life givers, and keeping them close meant survival. Outside the walls of this cottage, you find hives in the oddest places, wedged into church courtyards, tucked into castle gardens, balanced on stone walls. People used anything they had to house bees. Clay pots, hollow logs, upside-down baskets. Even old helmets if nothing else worked. Beekeeping wasn't just a hobby. It was a vital part of household economy. In an age before sugar plantations and industrial farming, honey was the only widely available sweetener. That jar of golden goo on your shelf today. Back then, it might have been a family's entire inheritance. It sweetened their bread, glazed their meat, and soothed their burns. Oh, and about burns, let's talk about candles. You think blackout nights are rough? Medieval Europe had no electricity, and candles weren't cheap. Beeswax candles were reserved for churches and nobility, while the poor relied on smoky tallow ones. But even among the elite, beeswax was a treasure. Its clean burn and soft scent made it the preferred light of kings and bishops. And the bees, well, they just kept buzzing, unaware that their wax illuminated cathedrals. So, naturally, Anyone who owned hives guarded them jealously. Laws emerged quickly to settle disputes. If your neighbor's bees started frequenting your clover patch, tensions rose. If a swarm left someone's yard and settled in your tree, oh boy, get ready for legal drama. Ownership of a swarm was based on pursuit. The law said, if you followed the swarm and kept it in sight, it was yours even if it landed miles away. But if you lost sight of it, to bad. Finders keepers, losers. Bring a witness next time. This rule led to some of the strangest spectacles. Imagine grown men, robes flapping, sprinting through fields with buckets, shouting, "Still mine, still mine," as the bees sailed overhead. All this just to keep a claim on some wandering insects. Historians still argue whether these swarm chases were common or exaggerated by chroniclers for effect. Some accounts read like slapstick comedies. Others are oddly poetic, describing bee pursuits as a form of divine trial. Lose focus, lose the swarm, stay faithful, reap the sweetness. But it wasn't just about honey. Bee rights were tangled with land rights, spiritual belief, and even social status. A noble's hive was different from a peasant's, just ask the tax collector. In some towns, nobles were entitled to better pollen zones. Yes, bees got zoning privileges. And let's not forget the symbolism. Bees represented discipline, chastity, and divine order. A well-run hive reflected the perfect Christian community, everyone working selflessly for the good of the whole. This idea bled into every sermon, every guild charter, and of course every legal ruling involving bees. Now back in your mind's eye, you drift toward the monastery on the hill. There, in a quiet herb garden, monks kneel beside hives, murmuring prayers. They believe these bees are sacred helpers gathering heaven's nectar. The rules here are even stricter. If a monk's bee stings a pilgrim, that bee is a sinner. If a swan lands on the altar, that's not just trespass, it's heresy. And the punishment. Sometimes the bees were relocated. Sometimes a ritual warning was given, complete with Latin chants. Sometimes the hive was destroyed. And sometimes, yes, the bees were taken to court. The records describe scenes that feel half dream, half legal theater. Monks donning robes, reading formal charges to a box of buzzing insects. A chosen representative, usually another monk, arguing in defense. The bees were provoked. The pilgrim wore violet. Bees hate violet. Supposedly, they meant no sacrilege. You pause, and a smile tickles the corner of your mouth, somewhere between the reverence and the ritual. It becomes clear this was not a joke to them. These people believed deeply in the interconnectedness of all life. They saw bees not as pets, nor pests, but as moral agents, creatures bound, like humans, to the laws of God and man. So the next time you see a bee nosing around your window box, remember, in medieval Europe, that bee had a legal identity. It could trespass. It could sin. It could, on rare occasions, be forgiven. And inside those smoky stone cottages, where buzzing filled the silence and honey sweetened the struggle, people lived shoulder to wing with their tiny golden citizens, watchful, grateful, and occasionally ready to file charges. You find yourself now in the market square, cobblestones warm underfoot, the air thick with the scent of bread, leather, and livestock. Among the stalls hawking root vegetables and eel pies, one merchant is selling honey. Not in plastic squeeze bottles, no, in thick, hand-blown glass jars sealed with wax and pride. The price? Astronomical. You'd think he was selling perfume or gold dust, because honey was gold. In a world with no refined sugar and limited trade routes, honey was the sweetener of the people if you could afford it. It wasn't just a treat, it was medicine. It was antiseptic for wounds, a base for tonics, even a treatment for sore throats and battlefield injuries. If you lived far from a monastery and the nearest doctor was a drunk with a rusty knife, honey might be the closest thing you had to divine intervention. And it didn't stop there. In many regions, honey could be used as a form of rent payment or part of your feudal obligations. Yes, instead of money, you might owe your landlord a jar of honey every harvest cycle. That meant your bees weren't just buzzing insects, they were tenants working full-time on your behalf. And unlike your lazy son-in-law, they actually earned their keep. Medieval tax records from regions like Normandy and Bavaria include meticulous entries about honey. Tithes. Whole households were listed not by the number of cattle they owned, but by the number of productive hives. A noble might boast of land, soldiers, and be colonies in equal measure. That's how sweet the politics were. But the honey economy had its risks. A failed hive could mean starvation, a swarm stolen, financial ruin. And oh yes, swarm theft was a real crime, prosecuted with surprising seriousness. The records show that villagers would sometimes wake up to find their prized hive empty, and a neighbor suspiciously grinning over newly bottled honey. If confronted, the thief might claim the bees had simply chosen to relocate as if the insects just had a change of heart. But that excuse didn't always fly, and if caught, the punishment varied. Fines were common. Sometimes the stolen swarm was returned if it could be identified. Yes, that actually happened. People claimed to recognize their bees by behavior. Oh, that one buzzes sarcastically. Definitely mine. In extreme cases, particularly when the theft caused famine or ruined a tithe. The punishment was harsher: lashes, confiscation, or even exile. Historians still debate how widespread these punishments were. Some suggest they were more symbolic ways to demonstrate that the hive was part of a larger moral economy. Others think the laws were enforced strictly, especially in regions where honey made or broke. Survival. And oh, the lengths to which people would go to keep their hives safe. Beekeepers used everything from natural repellents to carved guardian figures, tiny wooden saints, to bless the bees. One record from 13th century Austria describes a farmer who slept in his field during swarming season, clutching a slingshot and whispering hymns. Not exactly your standard security system, but effective in its own weird way. There is something poetic about this, the quiet desperation of protecting a creature that could leave at any time. Unlike cattle or grain, bees could fly. You couldn't fence them, couldn't leash them, couldn't bribe them with snacks. You had to trust. And in a world that trusted little else, that was a sacred thing. Now look around the square again. That merchant selling the honey. He's not just trading syrup. He's trading status. If your household can afford a jar of honey, it means you're thriving. You're healthy enough to want flavor, rich enough to have choice. That little golden jar might as well be a crown. And so, hives were watched, bees were cherished, and anyone who tampered with that arrangement intentionally or otherwise risked more than just a few stings. They risked the full weight of local justice, and maybe even divine wrath. One curious law from a medieval English township required any new beehive to be publicly registered, with a chalk mark placed on the house door. This served as both a warning and a point of pride. "We have bees here," it said. "Approach with respect or prepare for court." That chalk mark became, in time, a symbol of dignity. Entire families identified themselves not by lineage or trade, but by their bees. Some took surnames like Beeman, Bissett, or appear echoes of this ancient reverence still tucked into modern phone books. And the bees themselves, they kept buzzing, faithful, tireless, and ironically utterly indifferent to the legal chaos swirling around them. It's in this quiet disconnect that the beauty of it all lies. Humans created a vast structure of law and belief, all circling these little golden workers. The bees, meanwhile, just did their job. No opinion on who owned them. No idea they'd been summoned to court. No awareness that their wax-lit prayers and their honey-cured infections. Just buzzing on. You step back now, watching the villagers barter, argue, protect, and praise the honey that keeps them going. And in the background, that soft, steady hum continues. It is the sound of labor, of worship, of survival. You wander now toward the edge of the village, past the last crooked fences and stony lanes, where the ground rises gently and the trees gather thick. There, nestled between elder shrubs and a low stone wall, lies the monastery, a quiet sanctuary of prayer, discipline, and bees. It might surprise you, but monks were among the most prolific beekeepers in medieval Europe. And not just because they liked honey on their barley bread. For these solemn men in woolen robes, bees were more than livestock, they were spiritual companions, living metaphors for obedience, chastity, and divine order. Tiny, flying monks with stripes instead of belts. Step into the cloistered garden and you'll see the hives, arranged with almost liturgical precision. Each hive was a gift and a duty, and the monks took their beekeeping seriously. Entire treatises were written in Latin about hive placement, seasonal feeding, and how to interpret the bees' behavior as signs from heaven. One particularly devout monk named Bernard of Clairvaux once declared that the perfect Christian community should buzz like a hive in harmony. Everyone knowing their place, everyone working toward the same sacred goal. A bit much, maybe, but admitted it's a poetic image. And this reverence came with rules. You didn't just let your bees do whatever they wanted. Monasteries had internal codes governing hive care. And when bees misbehaved, things got interesting. Take, for instance, the case where a swarm landed on the altar during Mass, a living, buzzing cloud above the Eucharist. The monks were horrified. Was it a sign, a punishment, a holy visitation gone wrong? The matter was taken seriously enough that the abbot convened a council not just of monks, but of outside theologians. After days of debate and careful observation, to ensure the bees didn't sting a priest, they decided on a ritual banishment. The hive was relocated to the farthest edge of the property, and a Latin prayer of spiritual separation was recited. This might sound strange, but remember, the medieval mind didn't separate the natural from the spiritual. Everything was infused with meaning. Every bee, every sting, every flight path. If a creature entered sacred space, it had to be acknowledged, and if necessary, punished. There are even records of bees being excommunicated. Yes, as informally banished from the church. Usually this happened when hives were believed to have violated divine order, like stinging a monk during a fast, or building inside the chapel wall. The punishment? A ritual reading of condemnation. The hive was sprinkled with holy water, and sometimes destroyed. Historians still argue whether these practices were symbolic or literal. Were monks really trying to drive out demonic bees? Or were these just ritualized ways of reinforcing their beliefs about order and control? Either way, the ceremonies were performed. The Latin was read. The bees, if they understood, gave no sign. You can't help but smile imagining a solemn-robed monk holding a scroll, standing before a hive, sternly pronouncing its sins. Apis mellifera, for your intrusion upon the sacrament and your sting upon brother Anselm's nose. You are hereby cast out. The seriousness of these events wasn't limited to monasteries. In some rural churches, local priests oversaw the disputes among villagers. A complaint might go, "Father, the bees of Geoffrey have invaded my hives and stolen nectar." And yes, this was followed by testimony, witnesses, in some cases, oaths. People believed bees could be trained, prayed over, even reasoned with. Some villagers spoke to their bees daily, not metaphorically, literally. They told them about the weather, the harvest, and family news. A good beekeeper was expected to keep their bees informed, especially about births and deaths, which brings us to a tender little tradition, telling the bees. When a loved one died, you had to inform your hive. Walk out to it, lean close, and whisper the name of the deceased. If you didn't, the bees might stop making honey. Or worse, they might die from grief. At least, that's what people believed. In one 14th century English tale, a farmer dies suddenly, and his family forgets to tell the bees. Within a week, the entire colony collapses. His widow weeps at the empty hive, apologizes aloud, and the next day, a new swarm arrives on its own. Divine forgiveness or coincidence? Historians shrug. Villagers saw a miracle. There's something strangely beautiful in all this. A tenderness, a belief that even the smallest creature deserved to be included in grief and reverence. The bees were not just buzzing furniture, they were part of the household, bound by invisible cords to the joys and sorrows of human life. And back at the monastery, the monks believed those cords extended to heaven. Some hymns even praised bees as servants of the light, bearers of sacred flame through their wax. Their buzzing, they said, was a kind of liturgy. You close your eyes and imagine it. The candlelight, the prayer, the scent of herbs, and somewhere, a low, steady hum. It's not noise, it's accompaniment, a choir of wings in service of something greater. Let's stay in that monastery garden just a little longer. The scent of lavender mingles with rosemary as bees float lazily between the blooms, drunk on nectar and discipline. A monk in a rough-spun robe kneels beside the hive, not to harvest, but to listen. He claims the bees are warning of something, a storm, a death, or just low pollen. You might raise an eyebrow, but in the medieval world, everything was a sign. If the bees swarmed early in the season, it could mean a poor harvest. If they refused to leave the hive, perhaps illness was coming. And if they circled a child, that child was said to have a prophetic gift or was cursed. Depends on which villager you asked. Beekeepers in the countryside whispered to their hives not just news, but spells, half prayers, half chants. These weren't always sanctioned by the church. In fact, many clergy warned against these sky spells, claiming they bordered on witchcraft. But people used them anyway, handed down through generations. One such spell from the Welsh borders went something like, "There's no more and sting no man. Find your queen and seek her plan. In oak or stone, make hive anew, and guard the home that's built for you." Chanted quietly, always at twilight, and always with one hand on the hive, just in case. Some even believed bees could sense sin. If your hive kept dying, you were encouraged to confess. One chronicler tells of a woman whose bees fled 3 times each time after she told a lie. Coincidence? Perhaps. But she later joined a convent, maybe to be closer to the bees. And then there were the colors. People believed bees were drawn to red and repelled by blue. Others swore they hated violet, especially on clothing. So if a bee stung you while wearing violet, some claimed you were at fault. You'd committed a floral offense. This belief went so far that certain churches banned violet robes during the feast of Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of beekeepers, just to avoid incidents. Yes, wardrobe laws for bees. Historians still debate whether these restrictions were enforced or just folk practice gone clerical. But records exist. Tiny footnotes in dusty scrolls reminding us how deeply bees were woven into theology and superstition. And let's not forget thunder. Medieval folks were terrified of thunderstorms, believing they were divine tantrums. And bees? Well, they got caught in the heavenly crossfire. Some believed that if you killed a bee during a storm, you invited demonic retaliation. Others believed bees could calm storms if you whispered a prayer and released them into the sky. You imagine it now, a frightened villager standing in the rain, uncorking a clay pot full of bees and flinging them upward with a shout. A mix of panic and devotion, and perhaps desperation. It wasn't just about superstition. These rituals and chants gave people a sense of control. In a world ruled by plague, war, and unpredictable weather, bees offered a small, buzzing circle of predictability. You care for them, they give back. You honor them, they stay. Break the rhythm, and chaos enters. Some bees even received names. Not the whole hive, just the queen. Usually named after saints or virtues. Charity, Benedicta, Lucida. Naming was a form of bonding. A way to say, you are part of us. And if a named queen died, it was treated like a death in the family. There might even be a little ceremony, a soft song, a prayer, That same energy spilled into bee charms, talismans worn or hung near the hive to protect both bees and beekeeper. Tiny carvings of saints, little iron discs inscribed with protective runes, even locks of hair tied with ribbon and hung from a nearby tree. Don't question it, just accept the magic. One of the more curious artifacts found in a German abbey was a small wooden plaque carved with the words, "May your wings carry my sins." Scholars still argue about its meaning. Was it metaphorical, a confession aid, or a genuine belief that bees could carry spiritual burdens away? You sit with that thought for a moment. The image is lovely, isn't it? Your feelings, gathered like pollen, carried far and made sweet. In these quiet fields, full of motion and myth, the bees weren't just insects. They were part of a living cosmic contract. Keep your word, honor the hive, whisper your grief, and above all, never wear violet on St. Ambrose's Day. You're walking now through a shaded glade where wildflowers cluster in soft yellow and blue patches, and the sun filters through the canopy in sleepy ribbons. Ahead, you spot a man standing perfectly still beneath a tree, arms slightly raised, holding a small wooden box. It's buzzing loudly. No, he's not meditating. He's catching a swarm. Swarming was a natural part of the bee cycle. When a hive grew too crowded, the queen and her entourage would take flight in search of new shelter. For medieval villagers, this was both a tragedy and an opportunity. Lose a swarm, and you might starve. Catch one, and you might just secure a year's worth of honey or even your standing in the community. And here's where it gets weird. You couldn't just take a swarm if it wasn't yours. Medieval law was clear. Possession of bees depended on pursuit. If your swarm flew off and you followed it without losing sight, it was legally yours even if it landed 3 fields over. But if you turned your back or blinked for too long, the swarm became fair game for whoever caught it next. So, imagine this. 2 men sprinting through a meadow, eyes locked on a drifting cloud of bees, shouting at one another over rights of ownership, while a priest watches from a distance to confirm whose gaze was unbroken. Yes, these were the bee chases of the Middle Ages, equal parts legal proceeding and slapstick theater. Some towns took this even further and required witnesses to the chase. A bee catcher might ring a bell as he ran, drawing villagers to testify later. He never looked away, not once, even when he tripped in the goose pond. Legal gold, of course. Disputes still erupted. What if 2 chasers swore they never blinked? What if one man found the swarm, but someone else claimed he had been mentally tracking it? Lawsuits followed, and sometimes, so did bee-based tools, not with swords, but with stinging accusations and hayforks. One surviving case from 13th century France involved a dispute over a swarm that had split mid-air and landed into different trees. Both men claimed the entire swarm. The village elders ruling each got half the hive. Literally, they sought the woven skep into. The bees were not consulted. Historians still argue whether these legal proceedings were widespread or regional curiosities. Some scholars believe only deeply bee-dependent economies, like rural Flanders or parts of Hungary, took swarm law this seriously. Others argue that the principles were so embedded in local culture that they had to be enforced, or else chaos would reign. You lean back now, the image of two men arguing over airborne insects drifting through your mind. It's comical, but it's also earnest. These weren't silly games. They were disputes about survival. Bees weren't pets, they were partners in staying alive. And when bees crossed into property lines, things got even more tangled. A bee might fly into a noble's orchard and gather nectar from guarded blossoms. Later, that nectar would become honey inside a peasant's hive. Was that theft? Some lords thought so. They demanded nectar rent for flowers used by peasant bees. This led to bizarre cases where villagers defended their hives by arguing that their bees had only visited wild flowers, or that the noble's flowers had not yet bloomed. Imagine taking a flowering calendar to court. It got worse. In some villages, lords would post wooden signs near prized orchards reading, "Sworn trespassers shall be taxed." It wasn't clear how the bees were supposed to read these warnings, but the villagers understood them loud and clear, and so people began fencing not just their land, but their airspace. Nets were hung between trees. Scent traps were placed at the border to lure bees away. And in a few extreme cases, rival villages planted decoy flower gardens on the outskirts to steal bee traffic and sabotage a competitor as honey yield. The bee wars, as local bards called them, were often petty, but every now and then they turned serious. One legend tells of a town in Bohemia where two rival guilds, the Waxmen and the Medrites, fought over swarm access. During an unusually dry spring, the feud escalated to sabotage, fistfights, and one unfortunate incident involving a catapulted hive. The conflict ended only when a shared flower meadow was created. Between them, a compromise signed with a wax seal shaped like a bee. Poetic justice. Through all of this, bees kept doing what bees do: flying, collecting, returning, repeating, indifferent to the chaos, oblivious to the claims, and entirely uninterested in borders or contracts. But humans, oh, we cared. And so the laws multiplied. Local councils published bee codes, outlining who could place hives where, how far from a neighbor's garden they must be, and even what kind of offering must be made if a swarm crossed into sacred ground. Often it was honey, sometimes bread. Once, in an Italian hill town, it was a full roasted pigeon. Don't ask. These offerings weren't just restitution. They were gestures to keep peace, to say, "My bees may have sinned, but I am humble." A way of keeping the community in balance, one sting at a time. And just when you think it can't get more absurd, you find this gem. A monastery in England required new beekeepers to take a vow before they could receive their first hive. A vow of patience, of listening, of gentleness. For the bee is meek to those who are meek. The scroll reads, "And wild to those who hurry." You imagine that vow now, whispered under a summer sun, with a skep in hand and hope in your heart. The sun is lower now, casting golden light through dusty windows of a modest village home. Inside, the beekeeper sits at a rough-hewn table, a cup of weak ale in one hand and a slip of parchment in the other. It's not a love letter. It's a legal document about bees. Yes, hives came with paperwork. In towns and rural estates alike, the ownership wasn't just verbal. It was written, sealed, sometimes even witnessed by clergy. A hive could be sold, inherited, gifted, or held in joint tenancy, like a cottage or a cow. And those contracts, they could get surprisingly detailed. Some included maps, floral boundaries, and stipulations for what would happen should the bees perish prematurely or swarm without consent. That's right, bee consent clauses. You chuckle softly, imagining someone asking a hive, "Do you plan to leave this summer?" And then waiting, solemnly, for the buzz of approval. Many of these documents were stored with town scribes or church officials, next to baptismal records and land deeds. Because hives weren't just personal property, they were economic engines. A productive hive could be worth more than a field of barley. One record from 14th century France shows a dowry that included for fine hives, each with a loyal queen, and 2 jars of dark honey. Romantic, maybe not. Practical, very. But bees didn't always behave. And when they didn't, lawsuits followed. There's a delightful if slightly tragic case from a village near Ghent. A young man named Elias accused his neighbor of neglectful beekeeping. After a swarm attacked his goats, Elias argued that the bees had been unnaturally aggressive and were clearly not of peaceful character. The accused beekeeper defended his hive's honor, claiming Elias's goats had provoked the bees by urinating near their base. The court ruled in favor of the bees but fined both parties for wasting the scribe's time. You shake your head, but you also get it. In a world where every jar of honey mattered, justice for bee-related injuries wasn't a joke. Another case from northern Italy involves a widow suing her late husband's brother for refusing to transfer hive ownership. She had a signed will, but the brother claimed the bees recognized only him. The judge ruled that the bees should be moved and observed for 1 full week. If they stayed with the widow, they were hers. If they fled, the brother could keep them. Historians still debate whether these betrayals were metaphorical performance or genuine legal efforts. Were they meant to uphold actual law or reinforce community norms with a theatrical flair? Some say both. What's clear is that bee-related litigation was common enough to appear in multiple legal codices. In 12th century Germany, the Saxon Spiegler medieval law book includes a full page on bee rights and punishments for hive theft. It outlines procedures for swarm claims, damages caused by stings, and how to handle disputes if multiple hives were kept on communal land. And in some towns, there were specialist bee arbiters, not full-time judges, but experienced beekeepers respected for their knowledge and fairness. If a dispute arose, both parties might agree to let the local bee man settle it, binding themselves to his judgment with a handshake and a loaf of bread. These arbitrators didn't just resolve property disputes, they also taught proper hive etiquette. One well-known rule was the 5-pace rule. Your hive must be placed at least 5 paces from your neighbor's garden wall, or you are responsible for any damage caused. 5 paces, not 6, not 4. Exactly 5. Why? Because bees apparently understood zoning laws. Of course, not all bee disputes were so civilized. Some devolved into quiet sabotage. People smeared foul-smelling herbs on rival hives, scattered decoy flowers, or released moths into competing colonies. It was dangerous, underhanded, and punishable, but it happened. And when caught, the guilty party might be fined in honey, expelled from the guild, or forced to sing an apology before the town. Yes, a literal song of apology. One such case in Normandy required the offending beekeeper to stand in the town square and sing a verse about the sweetness of peace and the bitterness of envy, while the crowd watched and the bees, presumably, buzzed along. You're starting to see the pattern, aren't you? Bees were more than insects. They were part of the moral order. A hive could be an object of love, status, revenge, or even comedy. And as you listen to these stories unfold, the buzz becomes more than sound. It becomes symbol. And still, amid all this human noise, documents, arguments, songs, the bees just worked. Each day, a dance between petals and hive. Each hour, a gathering. Each night, a soft hum in the dark. There's something comforting in that. Something unchanging in the face of all our fuss. Now you find yourself in the shadow of a small parish church. Its stone bell tower just beginning to catch the orange light of the setting sun. The churchyard is quiet except for that familiar hum. Bees. The hive is nestled near the old yew tree, half in shadow, half kissed by light. But something feels different this time. A low murmur of unease hangs in the air. A few villagers are gathered, whispering, glancing toward the altar doors. Something's happened. Inside, a boy lies on a cot near the sanctuary. His arm is wrapped in cloth. The story spreads quickly. He was stung by a swarm that broke off from the rectory as hive. His face turned red. His body trembled. And now he drifts between sleep and something deeper. The priest stands by the window, silent. And so, a trial is called. Not for the boy, for the bees. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But there are records actual. Preserved records of bees being summoned to court. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. In this case, the offending hive is brought into the church courtyard. In its entirety, witnesses gather. The judge, robed and slightly skeptical, reads out charges. This hive stands accused of grievous harm to the child Lucas, son of Martha, during an unprovoked incident. The words are formal, careful, absurdly respectful. Someone must speak for the bees. Usually, this duty fell to a monk or respected villager, someone who understood the rhythms of the hive and could argue, persuasively, that the bees meant no malice, that their actions were instinctive, provoked, misunderstood, that they had perhaps been disturbed by loud bells or sudden movement. The defense might include explanations of pollen scarcity, heat agitation, or even divine punishment. Perhaps, one elder says, the bees are responding to something we have failed to do. A missed offering, an untended grave, a lie told near the altar. These explanations weren't just superstition. They were searches for meaning in the unexplainable. And then came the verdicts. Sometimes the bees were pardon moved to a quieter spot, blessed and forgiven. Other times, the punishment was symbolic, a warning nailed to the hive, a prayer said for the boy's healing, and the bees' reform, and rarely, very rarely, execution. Yes, the destruction of a hive as a form of justice. It wasn't common after all. Hives were valuable, but when fear or grief overtook reason, fire or water might be used. A harsh ending for creatures that never knew their own trial. Historians still argue whether these betrayals were truly legal proceedings or elaborate rituals. Were they extensions of canon law, or a kind of emotional theater, allowing people to process tragedy through structure and story? Some call them folk courts, places where law met belief and wrapped itself in ritual. Others believe these cases were sincere efforts to maintain moral order in a world where everything was believed to have purpose, even a sting. You imagine now the bee lawyer, standing before the swarm, hands clasped behind his back, tone calm and persuasive. He speaks of loyalty, of hard work, of the Queen's leadership. He reminds the court that bees do not kill for pleasure. They die when they sting. Would any creature sacrifice its life without reason? And maybe that's what made these moments so human. The realization that the smallest life could be given the same structure of justice as the greatest. That harm demanded investigation. That even a hive could be heard. There is a documented trial in Switzerland from the 15th century, where the entire village gathered to debate the fate of a hive that stung a traveling monk. The monk survived, but demanded justice. The hive's defender was a local teacher who argued that the bees acted in self-defense. After the monk swatted at them, the verdict: the hive was to be moved to the edge of the village. The monk received a jar of honey and an apology from the beekeeper. Case closed. Another case from southern France involved a nobleman who claimed his neighbor's bees had spied upon him and learned the location of his hidden wine cellar. He accused them of theft, saying their honey had the flavor of his exclusive grapes. The court, in what can only be described as peak medieval comedy, tasted the honey to confirm. The flavor was indeed unusual. The verdict: the neighbor owed the nobleman a single hive but was allowed to keep the rest. You shake your head and smile. It's ridiculous, but also remarkable. A society so deeply connected to its environment that it invented legal language for bees that assigned them motives, protections, and consequences. And through all of this, the bees carried on, unaware, untouched, unchanged. They kept flying between blossom and hive, ignorant of parchment and verdicts. Their hum not of protest or remorse, but simply the steady rhythm of labor, of life. And somewhere, deep in the shade beneath the yew tree, the boy stirs. He breathes easier now. The priest kneels beside him, murmuring a prayer. The hive is pardoned. The world goes on. You're in a village tavern now, seated at a low wooden bench beside a man who smells faintly of smoke and sun-warmed beeswax. His hands are thick with calluses and tiny stings, badge marks of his trade. He's a beekeeper, though he prefers the term hive. Steward, less like an owner, more like a caretaker. He leans in and tells you stories. Not the kind you'll find in dusty archives, but the tales passed from keeper to keeper, tales that mix fact with fancy, rule with rumor. He tells you about a man who was excommunicated for slandering his bees, claimed they were cursed, lazy, and likely possessed. His priest, horrified by the blasphemy, banned him from the sacraments until he repented. to the bees. You laugh quietly, but he's serious. You see, in some corners of Europe, bees were seen as moral barometers. If they failed, it wasn't always their fault, it was yours. People believed bees were sensitive to lies, disrespect, and moral decay. If a family quarreled too bitterly, the hive might stop producing. If a secret affair occurred near the apiary, the bees might swarm in protest. This gave rise to a peculiar legal practice, pre-sting confessions. If you were stung, and it seemed undeserved, you might visit your priest for a confession, not for the sting itself, but because it was interpreted as a sign of spiritual imbalance. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or a cleverly disguised community pressure system. Either way, the bees were watching. Always. The old man at the tavern smirks and points to the rafters, where a dusty skep hangs like a forgotten crown. That one, he says, once judged a marriage dispute. He means it metaphorically, of course. But then again, maybe not. There's a recorded tradition in several regions where bees were present at weddings, sometimes even brought into the church, carefully concealed in baskets. Their presence was thought to bless the union. If they buzzed during the vows, it meant harmony. If they were silent, and if a marriage began to sour, couples might consult the hive. They'd sit near it, speak their grievances aloud, and listen for the bees' reaction. No buzz? Maybe reconciliation was possible. A loud stir. Perhaps it was time to separate. You smile, amused and charmed. But the old man grows quiet. He tells you that in times of plague, especially during the Black Death, people brought their bees inside not just to protect them, but to keep company. Entire households locked down together, humans and bees alike, sharing air, silence, and fear. Some even believed that bees could detect the plague before humans could. If a hive became restless or aggressive, it was a warning. They sensed the death in the air. The beekeepers would whisper. In one account from the 14th century, a village in Saxony was spared an outbreak. Why? Because the town's main hive reportedly fled the village days before the plague arrived. The villagers took it as a sign and quarantined early. The records show that while surrounding villages lost hundreds, they lost just 3. You might chalk it up to luck. Historians remain divided, but the villagers swore by their bees. There were even laws that required the inspection during epidemics. Local magistrates would consult beekeepers, asking for reports. Were the hives calm? Were the bees abandoning brood? Were they producing less honey? If so, it was time to ring the plague bell. This led to the rise of the bee watchers, appointed individuals tasked with monitoring hive behavior. During health crises, their reports were kept in town ledgers alongside fever counts and quarantine orders. In some ways, they were the medieval version of a public health alert system, only furrier, and with more pollen. Back in the tavern, the old man drains his cup and nods toward the door. Want to see something? You follow him out into the cool night air. Stars prick the sky, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of earth and pine. He leads you to a small garden behind the inn, where a row of hives rests under moonlight. He taps one gently. No response. He whistles. Still nothing. Then he leans in close and whispers, Thank you for staying. A few bees stir, just a few. A soft hum, almost like acknowledgement. You realize something. These stories aren't about control. They're about connection. About people so intertwined with their world that they couldn't tee. Imagine separating themselves from the creatures that made life sweet and dangerous. And maybe that's why they gave bees trials, lawyers, and names. Not because they believed bees were people, but because they hoped they themselves could live as honorably as the hive. You're walking now along the narrow lanes of a bustling market town. Let us say somewhere in 13th century England. A fair is underway. There are jugglers and pickpockets, carts stacked with turnips, and that unmistakable scent of sheep who've been far too sociable with. The cheese store. But through it all, your ears catch something familiar. The hum of bees. There's a stall at the far end of the market, covered in linen and guarded by a young girl with a steady gaze, and arms folded like she means business. In front of her, jars of honey, beeswax candles in curious spiral shapes, and something odd a tiny scroll with a wax seal and a bee emblem. You approach, and she explains. This is a hive deed, declaring that the honey for sale came from a certified, monastery blessed hive that had never been involved in theft, blight, or legal dispute. It's a marketing gimmick, yes, but it reflects a real phenomenon, the rise of official hive documentation in medieval towns. As trade expanded, so did the need for honey traceability. Town councils and church-led markets began issuing papers attesting to the purity and peace of a hive, and not just for food safety. No, these documents often doubled as character references for the beekeepers themselves. If you wanted to sell your honey in the main square rather than the muddy outskirts, your bees had to have a clean legal record, and so did you. Imagine that, being turned away from the honey guild because your bees once trespassed into the Bishop S. flower garden. Some regions developed what historians now call the guilds, associations of apiarists who shared tools, knowledge, and legal protection. These guilds operated like trade unions, but with more buzzing and less beer. They had rules, they had membership oaths, and they had internal courts. Yes, guild courts. If you violated hive placement distance, used cursed flowers, lavender was suspicious in some regions, or allowed your bees to swarm onto guild land. Without notice, you could be fined, suspended, or in rare cases exiled from the honey trade. Entirely, the guilds even developed a symbolic language. Painted signs near hives marked their status: green for free to forage, red for noble property, and blue for sacred space. It was like a traffic light system, but for bees. And only those trained by the guild knew how to interpret the symbols correctly. One old text refers to this practice as bee banners, another calls them nectar flags. Either way, the idea was simple: prevent conflict, protect the bees, and keep the honey flowing smoothly through legal channels. But bees weren't just a commodity. They had emotional weight, too. Some families treated their hives like heirlooms, passed down through generations, carefully documented and tied into local rites. There is a record of a noble woman in 1298 who left her favorite hive to her daughter in her will not for the honey, but because she believed the bees held her secrets. According to family tradition, she had whispered every sorrow and confession into the skep's entrance, a kind of buzzing diary. Her daughter inherited the hive, the land it sat on, and the responsibility of continuing the whispered tradition. Think about that. Not just land or wealth, but trust in a colony of insects. And this spiritual thread ran deeper still. Enter the ritual of the hive blessing, a once-yearly event in many villages, usually performed at the start of the swarming season. A priest would walk the boundary of the hives with incense, reciting psalms and sprinkling holy water. Beekeepers would kneel beside their colonies, praying not only for honey, but for harmony. Some churches even incorporated bee liturgies into their calendars. Special masses for Saint Ambrose, patron saint of beekeepers, often included lines praising bees for their humility, order, and loyalty. In some cathedrals, choirs would mimic buzzing sounds softly, reverently during certain hymns. Picture it, a stone nave filled with candlelight and a gentle hum, rising like wings toward the vaulted ceiling. And in return, beekeepers gave back. Honey offerings were common, one jar for the poor, one for the altar. A wax taper was often lit in memory of those who died in the past year. A tiny flame said to carry the soul skyward, guided by the wisdom of bees. Even courtship began to draw from this symbolism. Lovers carved bees into gifts. Poems compared affection to honey. And there were rules, oh. There were always rules. One popular custom required a suitor to offer a girl as family a small honey cake and a beeswax candle. The candle was meant to symbolize steady light, the cake, sweetness without bitterness. If the girl accepted both, it was considered an agreement to begin formal courtship. But sometimes the symbolism backfired. A young man in Wales was rejected because he gave the candle, but forgot the cake. Her family claimed he promised light without joy. His defense: I ate the cake on the way. He remained single. Historians still debate whether these romantic rituals were widespread, or just charming village customs recorded by nosy scribes. But the documents exist dotted across Europe, all tied to one golden thread. Bees meant meaning. And so, even in love, even in legal squabbles, even in religious rites, the hive remained central. Bees were not merely producers. They were mirrors reflecting human hopes, fears, ambitions, and frailties. You leave the market now, walking back toward the quiet edge of the village. In a small field, you see a young boy lying on his belly, chin in hands, watching a hive as if it were a living oracle. And maybe it is. He listens to the hum, to the order, to the mystery. And in the gathering dusk, you feel it to that ancient buzz, not just in your ears, but in your bones, a reminder that life, like honey, is made from tiny, tireless acts. The morning fog hangs low over the village commons. It softens the outlines of the trees and turns familiar fences into ghostly silhouettes. Somewhere beneath that mist, the hive stirs. You can't see the bees, not yet, but you can feel their rhythm in the air, a gentle pulsing presence. You're walking alongside the steward of the manor estate, a tall, stoop-shouldered man named Godfrey, who carries a ledger under one arm and a short stick for pointing. He's inspecting property boundaries, not for taxes, not for planting. No, today's inspection is about royal bees. In many parts of medieval Europe, land granted by the king often included swarms and airspace. Yes, bees born on royal land were considered royal property. If a hive swarmed and landed on your tree, you couldn't just clap your hands and claim it. You had to notify the steward, who would document the swarm's position and determine whether it belonged to the crown. It sounds laughable, but this was serious business. Kings and nobles depended on the revenue, especially in times when coin was scarce. Honey and wax could be taxed, stored, even traded as political currency. Some royal charters include language like, "All hives in the forest of thus and so are subject to the jurisdiction of the crown and its appointed watchers." That's what Godfrey is, a bee watcher, among other things. He stops near a mossy oak and points upward. A dark cluster hangs from a branch like a sleepy fist. A new swarm. If it's still there by dusk, he mutters, "We'll summon the bellman." You raise an eyebrow. The bellman, in several regions, swarms had to be declared publicly, like a birth or a crime. A designated bellman would walk through the village, ringing a small bronze bell and calling out, "By right of wind and flight, a royal swarm has landed." This announced the hive's status and prevented anyone from quietly pocketing it. If someone did try to steal a royal swarm, the punishments varied, usually a fine, sometimes loss of land access, and in rare cases, temporary banishment from village markets. Essentially, you were put on social timeout for messing with the king's bees. Some bold or, perhaps, foolish villagers challenged these claims. There is a document from 1281 in northern England where a miller insisted the bees chose him and that the king could keep his crown, but not his flowers. He was fined 3 barrels of mead and made to kneel before a wax effigy of a bee in the town chapel. Humiliation was half the punishment. Historians still argue whether royal bee rights were enforced consistently. Some claim they were mostly ceremonial, a way to show dominance without sending soldiers. Others believe the laws were taken extremely seriously in regions where wax was needed for large religious institutions. And yes, it's worth noting, churches and kings often competed for bee territory. The crown wanted hives for taxes and diplomacy. The church wanted bees for sacred light candles that burned clean and pure before the altar. In some border regions, it wasn't uncommon for a priest and a sheriff to argue over a single swarm. One anecdote from France tells of a bishop who hired a choir to sing to a wandering hive in hopes of luring it back to his garden. The sheriff, unwilling to provoke divine wrath, allowed the performance. The bees returned. The bishop declared it a miracle. The sheriff declared it highly suspicious. Case closed. But royal bees weren't just property, they were diplomatic tools. In medieval diplomacy, gifts mattered. A falcon, a bolt of silk, a carved box of spices. But one of the more coveted gifts, believe it or not, was a hive. A productive, peaceful, healthy hive, preferably with a strong queen and a track record of sweet honey. Noblemen sent hives to one another as tokens of peace or loyalty. A prince might send a hive to his bride's family. A feuding lord might offer a hive in apology. The language of bees was subtle but clear. We bring you sweetness, order, prosperity, The most famous example, a treaty between two warring houses in what is now Austria was sealed with an exchange of bees. Each family sent a hive, along with a poem. The document still survives in fragments. One line reads, "Let our quarrel fly, away like drones unwelcome in the hive." It wasn't just poetic, it was practical. These hives served as early indicators of sincerity. If one party poisoned the gifted hive, it was a sign of betrayal. If the hive thrived, it meant the peace held. Bees became the canaries in the coal mine of courtly trust. Back on the estate, Godfrey jots something in his ledger and sighs. Too many trees, not enough watchers. He looks at you. You think bees care for titles. You both know the answer. They don't. They follow the queen. Build the hive, store the honey. They fly for flowers, not flags. But humans crave order, ownership, recognition, and so we labeled them peasant bees, noble bees, royal bees as if their wings could carry property rights. We built borders round nectar, assigned titles to insects, and, when necessary, dragged them into the swirl of human politics. Still, the bees went on, through war, plague, and proclamation. They kept doing what they'd always done, building, gathering, buzzing in harmony. And when kings fell and parishes burned, when treaties crumbled and scrolls faded, the hives still stood tucked in trees, carved in walls, sleeping beneath stone abbeys, the true survivors of history's quietest empire. The wind shifts now, tugging at the folds of your cloak as you climb a stony hillside. Below, the village dozes in soft golden haze, smoke curling from thatched rooftops. But up here, near the edge of the woods, stands a curious sight. An overgrown shrine half-chapel, half-hut with a sagging roof and carved bees circling its doorway like a frozen swarm. Locals call it the Whispering Hive. They say it once belonged to a hermit monk who lived alone with his bees and spoke only when absolutely necessary, when villagers came to him seeking healing, blessings, or advice he didn't speak to them. He spoke to the bees, and if they responded with a buzz, that meant yes, silence meant no. You step carefully around fallen stones and moss-covered benches, and you realize this wasn't just some bee-crazed recluse's lair. No, this was a consecrated space, built deliberately as a kind of bee sanctuary, part of a tradition that once spanned much of Central and Eastern Europe. These sacred bee spaces were places where religion, superstition, and law blurred into something uniquely strange. Within the church, there had always been a fascination with bees, their celibate queens. Tireless work ethic and geometric genius made them powerful symbols of order and grace. In monasteries, bees were often cited as exemplars of monastic living, devoted, quiet, productive. So it's not surprising that some religious figures began treating them almost like saints in miniature. That led to one of the oddest developments in bee history: bee relics. Yes, you heard that right. In some places, when a particularly blessed hive produced a miraculous crop of honey, perhaps during a famine, or when a plague passed them by, the wax from that hive was preserved in churches like sacred bone, shaped into small beeswax figurines. These holy bees were stored in reliquaries or burned during prayer vigils. A few cathedral records even mention processions featuring wax bees carried on velvet cushions. Historians still argue whether these relics were meant to be taken literally or symbolically. Did believers genuinely think the wax held power? Or was it simply a form of gratitude? A way of honoring nature's faithful workers? Either way, the tradition stuck. Even in more secular settings, bees crept into ritual law. Some towns required that certain oaths, especially land transfers, or peace agreements, be sealed with both a wax stamp and a jar of honey. This wasn't just a quirky custom. It symbolized harmony, cooperation, sweetness in agreement. There is even a record from a 14th century Italian city where a couple divorced by biting the same honeycomb, then turning from each other. Strange, yes, but strangely poetic. It was believed that to involve bees or their products in any agreement was to invoke their sacred order, their perfect architecture, their silent cooperation. If you betrayed the agreement, you weren't just a liar. You'd violated the bees, and bees, it was said, remembered in Brittany. One famous superstition held that bees could carry memory across generations. If you wronged someone and never confessed, your family's hives would sour, the honey would taste strange, or the wax would crumble when lit. Whole villages whispered of haunted honey. To prevent this, people developed rituals of bee confession, not just telling the bees about a death, as we've discussed, but confessing your own sins aloud near the hive. Quietly, respectfully. Some even left gifts, apple slices, flowers, a ribbon, a peace offering. One fascinating detail from a German town's legal record shows that during disputes over land or livestock, both parties were required to visit the hives on the hill and speak truth before them. The idea was simple. Bees could not be lied to. If you dared lie in their presence, your own hives might rebel or vanish. That brings us to another legal curiosity: vanishing hives. When a hive disappeared overnight, it wasn't always chalked up to theft or disease. Sometimes it was seen as punishment. Bees, it was believed, could detect injustice and would flee from a wicked household. There are dozens of accounts of hives mysteriously abandoning homes after fights, betrayals, or broken promises. One case in Hungary tells of a merchant who underpaid a widow for her honey. That night, his hives emptied. The bees were found the next day in the widow's garden. He accused her of witchcraft. The town priest ruled that bees go where they are welcome and dismissed the charge. The lesson: don't cross someone whose friends have wings. Some laws even attempted to prevent bee betrayal, a rare but very real fear. If a hive's keeper moved them too often, failed to protect them from storms, or harvested honey too early, it was considered neglect. Not just bad practice, but a moral failing. In such cases, the local beekeepers' guild could intervene. They'd inspect the hives, listen for abnormal buzzing, and if needed issue a punishment. This might be a fine, a public apology, or, in a strange echo of human justice, hive reassignment. Yes, your bees could be taken from you. There is a case in Flanders where a man named Peter was found guilty of impatience and greed with his swarm. The guild removed his hive and placed it under the care of a rival keeper. until such time as Peter mended his ways. A month later, he begged for them back, promised to never over-harvest. His bees were returned, sweetness restored. As you stand before the whispering hive chapel, you imagine that long-gone hermit whispering his own confessions into the soft morning hum. No court, no crowd, just him, the bees, and the strange truth that even in silence, accountability matters. Maybe the law was never really about the bees. Maybe it was always about us finding structure in the chaos, purpose in the sting, and meaning in the golden threads that connect us all. And maybe, just maybe, we needed the bees to teach us how to be better humans. You leave the chapel behind, the carved bees still buzzing in your memory. The path now winds past fields tinged gold with early wheat, and sleepy cows swatting flies with their tails. In the distance, you hear the metallic echo of hammer on anvil, someone working, even at this hour. But it's not a blacksmith you're approaching, it's a candle maker. The shop smells heavenly, not like incense or herbs, but something simpler. Beeswax, melted and reformed again and again. The candlemaker, an elderly woman with steady hands and wax-stained sleeves, nods as you enter. She's shaping tapers for the church, not with molds, but by hand, dipping wicks slowly, rhythmically, into golden pots of wax. You ask her how long she's done this. She shrugs. Since the bees taught me, and she means it. Because in the Middle Ages, candle making was a sacred act, especially when using beeswax. It was more than a trade, it was a calling, tied to the church, to seasonal festivals, and to spiritual purity. Only beeswax candles could burn on the altar. Tallow candles made from animal fat were for taverns, homes, or, as some priests liked to say, for places where sin already lingers. The difference wasn't just spiritual. Beeswax burned cleaner, brighter, longer. In an age where darkness was dangerous, beeswax was a light of assurance, and the people who made these candles weren't simply artisans, they were guardians of sacred flame. That status came with rules. Guilds of candle makers had strict codes. Only wax from hives that had never caused offense could be used for church candles. If a hive had trespassed, stung, or been the subject of a legal dispute, its wax was unclean. Some even required priests to bless the wax before the candle was made. You think that's superstition? Sure, but to them, it was quality control and spiritual sanitation. There's an old story from Spain about a candle that wouldn't light during Mass. The priest halted the service, checked the candle, and declared, "This wax has known deceit." Turns out the beekeeper who sold it had lied about a boundary dispute. The candle was removed. The Mass continued. The congregation nodded, solemn. Historians are divided. Was this religious theater or genuine faith? Perhaps both. But the records are full of these wax interruptions. Moments when something as simple as a failed flame stopped time and forced reflection. It's not hard to see why beeswax held this power. When shaped into candles, it became more than light. It was a symbol of order, of purity, a substance created not through violence, but through cooperation, bees working together in darkness, crafting a gift for the world. And so, wax became part of the legal and emotional economy. In some towns, Wax was used to pay debts. A taper was equal to a loaf of bread, a larger pillar candle, worth a chicken or a day's labor. And for those who couldn't read or write, candles were used as signatures. You'd press your marker nail, a sigil, even a bee pin into warm wax beside your name. On a contract. Even more curiously, some legal documents weren't sealed in wax, they were written on it. Yes, flat beeswax tablets were used in some regions as erasable writing surfaces. A stylus carved into the soft surface, and if you needed to revise a clause, just warm the tablet, smooth it over, and start again. Perfect for contracts and for secrets. There is a story of a merchant who used wax tablets to record both his debts and his prayers on opposite sides. He claimed that if he died suddenly, at least one side would help him. But wax was also political. In royal courts, the size and color of a wax seal could convey status. Red wax for urgent matters, black wax for mourning, golden beeswax reserved for matters of spiritual importance, treaties, land gifts to the church, or letters to the Pope. In 1327, a count in Burgundy sent his final will to Rome, sealed in a wax disc shaped like a bee. He wrote, "Let this creature, which labors without question and stings without joy, speak for my soul when my voice fails." You imagine the Pope squinting at that seal, gently turning it in his fingers. And somewhere, far away, the hive that made that wax continued, unaware of its diplomatic duty. Back in the candlemaker's shop, the old woman dips the wick again and lifts it, golden and gleaming. She tells you that in her youth, her grandmother said you could hear the bees in the wax, that if you listened closely to a burning candle, you could make out the faint memory of the hive. Not buzzing, not sound, just presence. You try it later in your room. You light a beeswax candle and lean close. It crackles softly, flickers with purpose. And though you hear no hive, no wings, there's something there, a weight, a warmth, a whisper of labor long completed. Bees built this, and in a world that so often felt chaotic, cruel, and unpredictable, this light, the result of silent toil and collective harmony, became something people could believe in. A testament to the power of structure, of balance, of creating something beautiful without destroying anything in the process. So it's no wonder that when disputes arose over land, over truth, over guilt, people reached for wax, not just to seal the verdict, but to bless it, to say, "Let the light that comes from this never flicker with falsehood," because long before electric bulbs and ink-stamped forms, we sealed our promises in gold poured slowly from the quiet cathedral of the hive. You're farther from the village now, walking a sun-dappled forest path where the air is cool and fragrant. Ferns crowd the underbrush, and above, the trees filter light like stained glass. A gentle hum floats between the trunks, not loud, not ominous, just steady. Bees. Wild ones. This time, unlike the carefully tended skeps and box hives of the village, these bees live in hollow trees, cracks in boulders, and sometimes old bird nests. They are unclaimed, untamed, yet even these hives fall under medieval legal scrutiny, because in this part of the forest, known as the King's Grove, Everything including the bees is subject to forest law. Forest law was a separate, often stricter legal code that governed hunting, grazing, foraging and yes, beekeeping on land designated as royal or noble property. It protected not just trees and deer, but also the right to harvest wild honey. And wild honey was a delicacy, darker, stronger, with a tang of nettles and pine. Harder to find, harder to extract but prized. A good stash could earn you favor with a baron or bishop, or get you arrested. You see, removing honey from a king's grove without permission was poaching, on par with killing a royal stag. If you were caught carving into a hollow tree with honeycomb inside, the punishment was swift. Sometimes a fine, sometimes a hand, sometimes, in more lenient villages, a year's ban from the common fields. One law code from 1253 specifies, "No man shall meddle with the bees of the wood, unless granted license by seal and blessing." That is right, you needed both a legal permit and often a church blessing to take honey from wild hives. The idea wasn't just to prevent theft, it was about preserving balance. Wild bees pollinated the groves. Disrupting their hives risked upsetting the natural economy. Enter the role of the forest apiarist, a designated keeper of wild hives, chosen for knowledge, discretion, and a strong resistance to stings. These men and a few women were tasked with monitoring the forest colonies. They didn't harvest all the honey, just enough. They left wax for regrowth. They marked trees with carved bee symbols to show which ones were protected, which ones were productive, and which ones were angry. Some of these forest keepers used elaborate systems of bee bells, tiny bronze chimes hung near hive entrances, believed to calm the bees and alert nearby foragers to their presence. If the bells were missing or tampered with, it was evidence of trespass. Historians are divided on whether the bells actually influenced bee behavior or were simply for human convenience. But numerous bell fragments have been found near ancient groves, so at the very least, they were used and believed in. There's also the tale of the Whisper Tree, where villagers left offerings, bread crusts, coins, poems to the bees who see everything. It became common law that confessing near this tree might earn you forgiveness or a warning. One record from Bohemia mentions a man who visited the tree after stealing a cartload of firewood. He knelt, apologized, and placed a wax candle on the roots. Days later, a passing noble pardoned him unexpectedly. Coincidence? Divine reward? The bees don't say, but perhaps the most curious part of forest bee law was the sting testimony. In disputes where ownership of a wild hive was unclear, the apiarist might extract a single bee from the contested hive and place it near the accused. If the bee stung, it was taken as a sign the hive had been wronged. If it flew away peacefully, the man was considered innocent. This may sound absurd now, but for people who lived so closely with the land, it made a certain kind of sense. Nature as witness, the bee as judge. After all, who knows a hive better than its own worker? There is a surviving scroll from 1310 where a bee sting in court settled a years-long feud between two cousins. The scroll simply reads, "The bee did speak. End of case." And if this all seems too quaint or too far-fetched, consider this. Many of the same forest bee laws were eventually adapted into urban guild rules and municipal ordinances. What began as a system for wild woods became part of the framework for civic apiculture, the management of bees within city walls. Cities like Paris and Prague developed rooftop hives. Clerks were trained in swarm relocation. Legal notaries began including bee clauses in property deeds. One clause reads, "Should the hives on the north wall produce no fruit, the tenant may reduce his rent by 1 loaf per week." It's hard to imagine today, but in a world lit by fire and bound by seasons, bees were currency, contract, and community. Back in the grove, you pause beside a tree with a wide hollow. Inside, faint glimmers of wax catch the light. The bees are working, utterly indifferent to your presence. You whisper a soft thank you and back away. Because here, in the hush of leaves and wings, the line between law and reverence dissolves. You're not just a visitor, you're a witness. And if the bees are listening, they'll remember how gently you walked, how respectfully you looked, and how quietly you left. You return to the village just as twilight settles in. Chimneys puff thin trails of smoke. Lanterns glow amber in windows, and the streets quiet down, save for the soft clatter of hooves and the last shout of a merchant packing away his turnips. You pass the chapel, the smithy, and finally the small square where the town records are kept in a modest stone hall. Inside, the clerk, a weary man with spectacles older than most buildings, nods without looking up. He's cataloguing documents, not military records or royal decrees. He's reviewing the disputes. There are more than you'd expect. One scroll recounts a disagreement over hive shadows, yes. Shadows. A villager complained that his neighbor's hives, placed too close to the property line, were casting shade on his herb garden. He argued that this diminished the quality of his mint and basil, which in turn made his honey inferior. The court appointed a scribe to observe the sun's movement for 3 days, before declaring that the hives must be moved by a length of 2 turnips. Another record details a singing dispute. A group of women claimed their neighbors' beekeeping songs were off-key and upsetting the bees. He insisted the bees liked his voice. The judge asked the local priest to sing a sample hymn, then requested the beekeeper to do the same. The verdict: both were terrible, but the bees seemed to prefer silence. Singing during harvest was henceforth banned unless accompanied by soft bell chimes. And then there's the midnight trial, a curious case held after dusk, lit only by beeswax candles. A boy had been accused of stealing honey from a guild hive. The evidence was a sticky tunic and one very grumpy bee found in his sleeve. The guild demanded punishment, but the judge, perhaps moved by the child's terror, ruled that one who carries a bee in his sleeve seeks not theft, but friendship. The boy was released with a warning and a small candle to light his walk home. These tales might seem quaint, even ridiculous, but they show something important. Bees were more than livestock or metaphor. They were woven into every thread of community life, legal, social, spiritual, even musical. And perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in the bee oath, recorded in several villages across Europe. The bee oath was a ceremonial vow taken by new beekeepers, sometimes administered by a guild. master, other times by a priest or elder. It bound the keeper to a code of ethics, not just practical care, but moral duty. One version goes, "I shall not rob nor rush, nor harvest too soon. I shall protect the hive from storm and greed, and share sweetness with my kin. I vow to speak to them gently, and tell them of deaths, births, and storms. If they fly, I shall follow. If they sting, I shall reflect." It's part prayer, part contract, part gentle meditation. And it illustrates a truth that modern law often forgets. That care and contract once walked hand in hand. This oath wasn't just for tradition. Breaking it had consequences. A keeper who was careless, who harvested honey while angry, or who ignored a hive in distress could be brought before the bee assembly, a seasonal gathering of local apiarists who shared techniques, settled disputes, and offered judgment. Punishments ranged from fines to forfeiture of hives. But more often, it was a public correctioner. Speech, a verse, a story told by an elder about the harmony of the hive and the dangers of pride. Shame was a more powerful tool than any fee. One account tells of a man who neglected his bees during a drought. His hives suffered. During the bee assembly, he was made to carry a wooden hive frame empty and ash covered through the market square while children rang bells and chanted, "Empty hive, empty heart." He never missed a watering again. You might laugh, but think about it. In a world where written law was limited, where people lived close and depended on one another, rituals shaped behavior more effectively than threats. And this brings us to the bee festivals. Not just solemn gatherings, but joyful, seasonal events tied to the rhythms of the hive. The Spring Swarm Festival, for example, marked the beginning of the season. Villagers wore yellow garlands, danced around poles wrapped in waxy ribbon, and even crowned a bee queen, usually the kindest or wisest girl in the village. She wasn't just a symbol. For the next season, she helped bless hives, guide new keepers, and speak at bee funerals are rare. But real event held when a beloved hive collapsed unexpectedly. Historians debate how much of this was universal versus regional. Some believe bee festivals were tied more to pagan roots than church teachings. Others argue they were a rare place, where folk wisdom and Christian ritual overlapped, a kind of rural middle ground where bees were honored not for being sacred or sinful, but simply useful and noble. And there's something beautiful about that. That even in a world full of fear of war, plague, drought, people still took time to celebrate bees. Not just because they gave honey or wax, but because they represented cooperation, order, and resilience. As you walk out of the record hall, the streets are empty now, lit only by the flicker of candles. Somewhere in the distance, a hive is humming gently in the dark. You don't see it. You don't need to. You know it's there, just like it's always been. Morning again, crisp and pale. The mist has cleared, and the village is awake. Chickens cluck. A cart creaks over cobblestones, and someone is already shouting about cabbages. You pass the green where children are chasing one another with sticks, one pretending to be a bee, and the others flailing with imaginary branches. Their buzzing is loud, dramatic, and delightfully inaccurate. But even here, in play, the reverence remains. Because in medieval life, Bees weren't just part of ritual or economy, they were part of education. Lessons about hives were among the first things children learned after walking, talking, and avoiding the outhouse bit. Parents taught them not only how to care for bees, but how to live like them. The lessons were simple. Always return home. Work together. Don't sting unless you must, and then be prepared for the cost. These were more than nursery rules. They were moral architecture framing how communities viewed duty, sacrifice, and purpose. And by the time a child was old enough to apprentice with a beekeeper, these values were baked in like honey into bread. In some monasteries, novice monks were required to study beekeeping texts alongside scripture. One manuscript, The Rule of Wing and Wax, survives in fragments. It includes diagrams of hive structures, notes on swarm patterns, and philosophical reflections like, the bee dies by its sting, but feeds the world with its labor. Such is the path of the holy man. And it wasn't just monks. Aristocratic children, too, were sometimes taught by law not to harvest honey, but to understand order. One noble tutor wrote, "Let your thoughts fly, but your actions return home, like bees to the comb." Another described the beehive as a micro-kingdom, a perfect model of hierarchy, queen above, workers below, each with their purpose, and all willing to sacrifice for the good of the hive. Historians often debate whether this analogy was useful or manipulative. Was the beehive used to teach cooperation or to reinforce feudal obedience? Probably both. But the result was the same. From peasant to prince, the hive was an ideal living metaphor for how people should exist. Together, this ideal found its way into folk tales and cautionary poems. You'd hear them sung at market or whispered before bed. Greater than buzz not in pride, lest you lose your queen. The hive collapses when hearts grow mean. Or this one, more light-hearted, greater than the bee who danced alone at noon, forgot the flowers, lost the tune. They're simple rhymes, but they taught responsibility, kindness, moderation. If a child misbehaved, an elder might say, "You're buzzing too loud. Go learn from the hive." That wasn't punishment. That was wisdom transmission, disguised as gentle scolding. Even the law reflected this ethic. Some town charters included the clauses not just about ownership or swarm rights, but about communal obligation. If a village hive was failing, others were expected to contribute wax or nectar to sustain it. Not because it was profitable, but because it was right. And if someone was known to neglect their hives, to overharvest, to ignore illness, to let a swarm die in cold, they might be publicly corrected, not by a judge, but by their neighbors. One account describes a woman leaving a bee shamer as token. A small wooden bee carved with a broken wing on a neglectful beekeeper's doorstep. A quiet accusation. The social pressure worked. Reputation mattered. And bees silent, watchful, tireless were considered reflective of their keeper's soul. This cultural entanglement ran so deep that bees even appeared in dream interpretation manuals. Dreaming of bees meant different things, depending on context. A peaceful hive signaled prosperity. A swarm signaled change. A single bee chasing you. You had unfinished business. Multiple bees stinging. You were being punished for hidden deceit. One cleric even warned his congregation, "If you see bees in your sleep, wake with purpose. They are not idle messengers." And speaking of messengers, there are accounts shaky, poetic, but persistent, of divination. A dying man might ask that a hive be consulted before his will was read. A bride might place a petal beneath a hive to see if the bees carried it away good luck, or let it fall bad omen. One mother claimed her child's future could be seen in the bees' first flight of spring. If they flew toward the sun, he'd thrive. If toward the woods, beware. Do we believe this now? Likely not. But in a world without guarantees, without medical certainty, or weather forecasts, all Banks' beliefs were architecture, and bees helped hold up the roof. So it's no surprise that the analogies spilled into every form of expression. Painters, scribes, priests, poets, they all reached for the hive. In illuminated manuscripts, margins often include tiny bees, flitting between flowers or forming halo-like rings around saints. In sermons, bishops compared the church to a comb, structured, sweet, built by faithful labor. In one 13th century poem, a knight wounded in battle describes his comrades as a hive that lost its queen. The metaphor isn't explained. It doesn't need to be. Everyone would understand. Because in that time, in that world, the bee wasn't just an insect. It was a mirror, a muse, a moral lesson in motion. And tonight, as you pass another hive humming softly in the dark, you understand why children are still taught to listen for the buzz not just in fields, but in life. The bees speak, not in words, but in work, in balance, in duty carried on wings too small for their burden. And somehow, they fly anyway. Night again, the stars are out, and the village is hushed. You're seated on a wooden bench near the apiary behind the chapel. A faint glow comes from a lantern nearby, casting honey-colored shadows across the ground. The hives are still, but not silent. Inside, thousands of wings tremble in harmony, soft, continuous, ancient. And in this quiet, your thoughts drift toward the endings of things. Because even in the meticulous world of medieval bees, there came a time when the hive failed. Maybe from disease, maybe from weather, maybe just old age. And when it did, the response wasn't always practical. It was often ritualistic. You begin to understand. The death of a hive wasn't just the loss of honey or wax, it was a communal wound. Let's say a beekeeper found their hive cold one morning. No buzz. No movement. Just stillness. The first step wasn't disposal. It was mourning. The keeper would often light a small beeswax candle beside the hive and say a few words not scripted, but heartfelt. Something like, "You fed us. You lit us. You stung us only when we deserved it." Then came the telling. Just as bees had to be told about human deaths, humans had to be told about bee deaths, especially if the hive had produced candles for the chapel or honey for the market. Notices might be posted. Bells might be rung, not the large church bells, but small handbells rung 3 times at dawn, the same way a death in the village would be announced. And in rare but deeply moving instances, a bee funeral was held. A procession, a symbolic coffin, sometimes a small basket of wax scraps. A priest or elder speaking a few lines about diligence, sacrifice, and sweetness. children scattering flowers, and then the burial of the comb in a sacred corner of the garden. Historians remain unsure whether these ceremonies were widespread or isolated expressions of local grief, but records of them appear from France, Germany, and parts of Wales, always with similar elements: silence, flowers, wax, prayer. Why such care? Because in a world where so much was violent and unpredictable, bees offered something steady and noble, and when they died, people felt it, not just in their cupboards, but in their hearts. But endings weren't always solemn. Sometimes they were legal. A dying beekeeper might include their hives in a will, not just who should get them, but how they should be kept. Do not sell the dark hive. One note reads, "It knows our land too well." Another, "Tell the bees of my passing before you take the honey, or they'll curse the comb." Some wills included funds for hive maintenance. Others instructed that honey from the final harvest be divided. One jar for the poor, one for the altar, and one to be buried with the keeper. A gift for the next life, perhaps. This leads us to the concept of the inheritance of care. Unlike livestock or land, which could be bought and sold, hives were often considered sacred trusts. To receive one was to receive responsibility. The community watched. The guild remembered. Neglect wasn't just failure, it was betrayal. And so, receiving a hive became an act of generational continuity. A way to say, I will do what they did. I will keep the order. I will serve the sweetness. And if a family couldn't maintain the hives, they might offer them to the church. In some abbeys, there are records of widowed hives, those donated by families after a death, tended thereafter by monks in quiet reverence. But it wasn't all grief. There were rebirths, too. After a hive collapse, it was common to place a sprig of fresh thyme near the entrance, a symbol of welcome, a promise that the space was ready to try again. Sometimes a child would be asked to name the new queen an innocent tongue believed to bring good luck. The new colony would arrive either lured by scent or brought from another apiary. And when it took hold, a candle was lit. The same candle that burned beside the old hive's body now marked the beginning of a new song. Life, death, and life again. A quiet cycle, a golden rhythm. Even outside the village, the symbolism endured. Royalty often received hives as wedding gifts, symbols of fertility, order, and prosperity. One French princess was given a golden hive encrusted with garnets, each one representing a drop of honey. The letter accompanying it read, "As these creatures build, with patience, may your house be formed of peace." It wasn't just ceremonial. Some of the greatest royal gardens housed extensive apiaries, managed not by peasants, but by court apiarists, who dressed almost like priests, spoke in hushed tones, and recorded the hive's behavior in velvet-bound journals. A royal hive collapse was noted in court logs alongside political alliances and harvest yields, because even at the highest levels, bees mattered. They reminded rulers of structure, of sacrifice, of the power in small things done consistently. And when those rulers passed, their bees were told, sometimes, their tombs were lit by beeswax candles made from their own hives, a perfect circle. Back in the village, the candles flicker low now, The stars spin slowly overhead. You feel the hush of wings unseen, the weight of stories carried on tiny legs. You think of all the hives that have come and gone, all the hands that have shaped them, all the hearts they've sweetened. And you understand, bees didn't just make honey, they made meaning. And we, for all our cleverness, are still learning how to keep up. The road turns muddy now, slick with spring rain. You're trudging uphill beside a traveling merchant. His cart creaks under sacks of barley, bolts of wool, and, nestled near the top, a single wooden crate humming faintly with life. A portable hive. Yes, bees could travel, though most hives stayed rooted in backyards and abbey gardens. There were some that went on journeys, carried carefully by merchants, monks, or messengers. These hives were gifts, bribes, or bargaining chips, a symbol of goodwill, loyalty, or sometimes calculated manipulation. The merchant nods at the crate. Noble bees, he says, trained on elderflower and poppy. You raise an eyebrow. Trained. He grins. They know better honey. Makes better candles. That makes better friends. Whether or not the bees were truly trained is debatable, but the belief was real. Bees raised on specific blossoms created honey with distinct properties. Some honeys were calming, others were energizing. Some were thought to cure coughs or heartbreak. And in medieval trade, a reputation for special honey could make or break a merchant. That's why some hives were bred for diplomacy. In the courts of England, France, and even Byzantium, carefully cultivated hives were exchanged between nobles by diplomacy. You might call it. The hive came with its own pedigree. Who had raised it? What plants it had visited? How long it had produced without swarming? Like a prize horse, but with wings. And the honey wasn't just food. It was gifted in crystal jars, laced with gold thread, or sealed with wax molded into tiny coats of arms. A baron might send a rival a token jar as a peace overture, or as a threat. My bees are thriving. Yours, 1/12th century Count famously sent jars of blood-colored honey dyed with wine-soaked berries to intimidate his enemies. He called it the comb of warning. Records suggest his enemies surrendered shortly after. But not all honey diplomacy was dark. In many cases, it was an offering of peace. There is a story from the Low Countries up to villages locked in bitter feud over a shared grazing path. Fences were sabotaged, wells fouled. But one spring, a boy from one village crossed the border with a jar of wildflower honey wrapped in his mother's apron. He placed it on the opposing village's chapel steps. No note, just sweetness. Within weeks, elders met. The feud ended. Historians remain skeptical of the tale's exactness, but the symbolism remains. Honey as gesture, bees as bridge makers. This idea trickled into legal custom in some towns. When a truce was formed or a new tenant welcomed, the signing wasn't sealed with a handshake, but a shared honey cake. To break bread was common, but to share honey meant trust because it wasn't just about feeding. It was about giving pleasure. And then there were the bribes. Yes, bees weren't always exchanged with virtue in mind. Corrupt officials might be sweetened with honey, especially during church appointments or tax assessments. In one case, A bishop was gifted a hive just before ruling in favor of a monastery expansion. The documents call it a generous offering of wax and spirit, but scribbled in the margins is a less holy note. He chose sweet over sharp. Some records show that during war, enemy scouts were offered honey cakes laced with herbs to induce sleep. An edible lullaby, hard to prove, harder to trace. But it shows how deeply bees were embedded in human strategy, and not just in politics, in romance. 2. A suitor might offer a carved comb of honey with a poem tucked into the wax. If the recipient kept it, the courtship continued. If she returned it melted or left it out to be devoured by Aunt Swell. Message received. There is a particularly dramatic tale of a young knight who carved the words, "I burn for thee," into a slab of wax, wrapped it in silk, and placed it on a noblewoman's windowsill. She replied by sending back a honeycomb shaped like a heart, hollow in the center. Ouch. These exchanges weren't just sentimental. They were legally admissible. In some towns, gifts of wax or honey could be cited as evidence of intention, romantic, political, or criminal. The sweet stuff left a paper trail. Even pilgrimages weren't free of bee business. Travelers often carried beeswax as offering not coins, not relics, but candles made from hives back home. To place one on the altar of a distant shrine was a way of saying, "Though I am far, I carry my community with me." This practice became so common that churches began setting aside special racks for pilgrim candles, some labeled with regions or family names. In one cathedral, beeswax pillars stood taller than the men who lit them, monuments to journeys made on sore feet and flickering hope. And what of those too poor to travel? They sent their bees, not literally, of course, but through wax, through honey, through proxy offerings. A widow in Brittany sent a single beeswax taper to Jerusalem with a passing knight. When he reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he lit it and whispered her name, for Colette and her hive. That candle burned for just an hour, but to her, it was eternity. You pass a small shrine now, set by the roadside. A single jar of honey rests at its base, glistening in the moonlight. No note, no name, just a gift, quiet and shining. Because long before banknotes, before scrolls and signatures, there was honey. And long before we trusted judges or kings, we trusted bees to work, to return, to mean what they made. And in the dark corners of deals, dreams, and devotions, we let them carry our hopes not just in their wings, but in every golden drop they left behind. The air is cooler now, and the village is nearly asleep. But the archive room in the scribe's house is still lit, candlelight flickering against shelves lined with cracked scrolls and leather-bound ledgers. The scribe stooped, spectacled, and smelling faintly of ink and onions leans over a parchment labeled "Lingering Laws," hive-related ordinances, active and unstruck. Yes, you've arrived at one of the oddest, most charming corners of history, the bee laws that never got repealed. See, while the medieval obsession with bees faded over time displaced by sugar, science, and changing economies, many of the old laws weren't erased. They simply lingered, tucked in legal codes like beeswax in a forgotten drawer. You read aloud. "It shall be unlawful for any person of station or trade to tempt a swarm with painted blossom, or song without cause or permit. It sounds ridiculous now, but at one time, people lured bees with colored cloth and gentle tunes. The law was meant to prevent poaching under the guise of poetry. Another reads, "No hive shall be placed upon the church roof without written consent of the parson and approval of the sexton escote." That's not a joke. In a Wiltshire village, the sexton's goat was trained to climb onto the roof and investigate hive placement. If the goat knocked it over, the hive was declared unsafe. These laws, while dusty and mostly unenforced, still exist in some places, relics of a time when bees were part of daily legal life. You find one from 1613 declaring that bees shall be exempt from collective punishment if their keeper breaks the Sabbath. The logic: bees don't know Sunday. Don't hold them accountable. Another, this one from Eastern Europe, states that if a beekeeper passes without air, his hive shall be opened to the town council. If the bees flee before sunrise, the land is cursed. The council's role was to observe. If the bees stayed, the land could be redistributed. If not, it might be left fallow out of superstition or respect. Imagine that in today's real estate market. This lot comes with excellent light and no historical bee curses. Some of these ancient laws made it into printed books as oddities. Others were quietly adopted into local custom, long after people forgot why. A beekeeper today might still place a sprig of mint on a hive after harvest, an old gesture of thanks mandated by law in several villages in the 1300s. And then there are the language remnants. Phrases like "mind your beeswax," often falsely attributed to etiquette or candle making, may have deeper roots. In some regions, beekeepers were warned not to tamper with a neighbor's wax, either to spy on production or alter trade samples. Minding your beeswax was literal. Don't touch what isn't yours. Another saying, "make a beeline," still carries that sharp medieval energy. Monks observing bees noted how they flew directly from hive to flower and back again. The term entered monastic teaching as shorthand for purposeful movement, a reminder not to dawdle. Even bureaucratic forms retained echoes of the past. In some rural French villages, land tax documents still included a line for apiary output. Even for homes without hives, it was simply assumed bees were part of the property, like a door or a well. But some laws took strange turns. In a town in northern Italy, a statute from the 1500s required that bee-related crimes be resolved with a wax duel. Each party would craft a figure of a bee in wax and present it to a council. The better figure, judged on realism and symbolism, would win. It was part justice, part art contest. And yes, it was taken seriously. You find another oddity in a Scottish register. Greater than should a woman carry a hive upon her head into the market square. She shall not be charged rent for the duration of her sale, provided the bees remain within. Why the exemption? No one's sure. Possibly it was considered dangerous work, or maybe the bees were thought to bring blessings to nearby stalls. Either way, it's an incentive you don't see often in modern commerce. And perhaps the strangest law of all? One German village maintained a clause stating that all bees who die in service to the town shall be memorialized. A small plaque in their market square still bears tiny carvings of bees, with little wings folded in rest. Historians believe it was a symbolic honor, maybe even satirical, but it was recorded nonetheless. This raises an interesting question. Why weren't these laws removed? Some say it was inertia. Others suggest they were left as curiosities, cherished as signs of local pride. More than one town historian has confessed they like having a few laws still on the books. It gives us character, one said, and the tourists love it. In some cases, new laws were written to replace the old ones, but the old ones were never formally erased. So now, tucked between modern statutes about zoning or parking, you might find lines about hive etiquette, bee song restrictions, and nectar trespass. There's even a growing movement to restore these laws, not as binding regulations, but as cultural heritage. Some towns host mock bee courts, reenacting historical cases. Children play the roles of lawyers, judges, and bees. The hive is often made of paper match, and the crimes are delightful nonsense, sting without consent, illegal nectar dancing, unauthorized pollen storage. The goal isn't legal clarity, it's connection, because even now, centuries after the last real betrayal, these laws remind us of something profound. That at one time, we lived so closely with nature that we wrote it into our books. That we believed every creature, no matter how small, deserved order, deserved fairness, deserved if not rights then at least recognition. You lean back as the candle gutters low. The parchment crinkles in your hand. The laws are silly. Some are sweet. A few are utterly baffling. But they're real. They're us. It's nearly midnight now. The village sleeps. The last candle in the chapel has flickered out. And even the dogs are quiet. You're standing in a meadow behind the oldest house in town, surrounded by wildflowers glowing pale under the moonlight. In front of you, a single hive. Its walls are dark with age, patched with wax and wire. The bees are asleep, clustered deep in the comb, warm and murmuring. Each one still connected to the other, antennae touching, wings twitching in dreams. And somehow, this tiny box of life feels like the heart of everything. You think back through all the stories, the betrayals and bee sermons, the bribes and duels, the singing monks, the quiet mothers whispering names into the hive after a death. You think of the laws, the oaths, the tiny tokens left beside chapel walls and buried roots. You think of the candles, of the sting testimonies, of the way even children knew to bow their heads when they passed a swarming cloud. It's overwhelming, but also comforting, because in every age through war, famine, fire, flood, people returned to this same truth. The bees stayed. They worked. They created order out of nectar, architecture from instinct, sweetness from wind. And so, we honored them. Maybe we got carried away. Maybe we made too much of them, called them monks or prophets or winged diplomats. Maybe we believed they could understand our grief, our treaties, our whispered apologies. Or maybe, just maybe, they could. Because the deeper you go into their history, the less the line between human and hive seems to matter. We governed them, but they also governed us. They gave us language, laws, ceremony, even comfort, and in return, we gave them names, and poems, and tiny wooden plaques carved with halos and wings. Even now, long after sugar replaced honey, after wax became synthetic and candles electric, something inside us still hushes when we hear a buzz. We still pause. We still look. We still remember. Not because we fear the sting, but because we remember the structure, the sweetness, the balance. So tonight, as you lie back in your bed and let your breath slow to match the hum you can almost hear in the air, know this: you're not alone. 1,000 years ago, someone else lay down under this same sky, listening to this same sound. Maybe they'd lost a hive. Maybe they were passing one on. Maybe they were simply watching the stars and thinking about small things that do big work. Just like you. Wind down approx. 300 words, so breathe deeply now. Let your arms grow heavy. Let your thoughts float like pollen on a breeze. The bees are sleeping deep in the comb, wrapped in warmth and wax. They've built their perfect circles, sealed their tiny chambers, and pressed their bodies close. For the night, you don't need to do anything more. You've wandered through centuries of strange and wonderful history, where law and legend blurred, and where creatures no bigger than your thumb-shaped religion, romance, and rule. You've watched hives fly like armies, sit like kingdoms, whisper like friends. You've listened to monks sing, to judges argue, to children play beneath flowering trees, all because of the hum of 1,000 tiny wings. And now, that hum carries you, soft, low, rhythmic, a sound not meant to stir, but to settle. Let it wrap around your mind like a thread of honey. Let it remind you that life real, meaningful life is made of small acts done with care, of returning home after the flight, of building the comb, one cell at a time. You are safe now. You are still and far away in the dark heart of the hive. The bees are still working, still dreaming, and you can rest. You've done enough for today. Sweet dreams.